Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a corner of history that nobody asked for, but that still existed anyway. Children born in medieval prisons. So get comfortable. Dim the lights, put your phone on silent, and if you're already halfway under the blankets, consider this your official excuse to stop scrolling. Because we're about to wander through the stone corridors of the Middle Ages, past the iron bars, and into the awkward situation of babies who happen to arrive in the world at the worst possible address. Now, before you panic, no, we're not here to do a grim expose on endless chains and torture devices. That's not the vibe. Think of this more as a slow, wandering tour through the oddities of medieval incarceration. The places were uncomfortable, yes. The people running them were confused, often corrupt, and sometimes just very tired. But they weren't always the pure nightmare that movies like to sell. And in that gray, slightly moldy space, children were sometimes born. Let's start with the basics. Medieval prisons were not really designed with long-term comfort in mind. In fact, they weren't designed with much of anything in mind. For most of the Middle Ages, prisons weren't even considered punishment. They were more like storage closets for inconvenient people, held there until trial, ransom, or execution. You didn't get sentenced to 20 years in prison. That would have seemed bizarre to a medieval judge. Why waste bread on someone who could just be fined, mutilated, or hanged? Instead, prison was temporary, a holding pen, which means that if a woman happened to give birth there, it wasn't because she was serving out a life sentence. It was usually because she had been arrested while pregnant, or because her stay dragged on for months or years. Bureaucracy moves slowly, after all, and medieval bureaucracy moved about as fast as a horse with gout. So what actually happened when a baby was born inside those walls? Well, that depended on money and rank, and whether anyone cared enough to intervene. In other words, it depended on luck, something babies rarely have in abundance. If the mother was poor, the odds were bleak. The baby might be left with her inside the same communal cell. Imagine a room of stone, straw on the floor, no real privacy, and a rotating cast of fellow prisoners who might include debtors, thieves, and the occasional drunk noble who annoyed the wrong bishop. Into that, a squirming newborn was placed. Medieval chroniclers occasionally note this with a sort of horrified fascination, like, "And behold, she gave birth in chains," which admittedly is a dramatic mental image. But it's also a reminder that shackles were not always removed, even during labor. Efficiency first, comfort second. Now, if the woman had family outside, say a husband, a sister, or even a neighbor, sometimes the child would be taken away almost immediately, deposited into the care of relatives, or perhaps left at a monastery as an unwanted mouth. Convents and monasteries often served as unofficial baby drop-off points. The monks didn't exactly advertise this service, but everyone knew. It's worth pausing here to remember that medieval society had a fairly elastic approach to child survival. Infant mortality was already high. Adding born in a prison didn't exactly improve the odds. So if a child survived infancy, it was often chalked up to divine mercy. Or, as one cynical monk once put it, proof that the devil cannot count properly. On the other hand, if the mother was wealthy, or at least socially noticeable, the story looked different. Wealthy women imprisoned, usually for political intrigue or displeasing a king, might be allowed servants. They might have a more private chamber, which is basically medieval luxury jail. Think fewer rats, better straw, and maybe even a door that locked from the inside. For these women, a baby born in prison could actually be something of a political chess piece. If the father was also politically important, suddenly this inconvenient infant became a matter of dynastic record. Royal scribes would dutifully note the birth, while everyone else awkwardly pretended not to notice that it happened between damp walls. For example, in England during the 12th century, there were noblewomen who gave birth while technically under house arrest or in castle prisons. Chroniclers wrote about it with a tone somewhere between gossip and exasperation. The implication was always, well, she couldn't stop being noble just because she was in chains, could she? And then there's the question of breastfeeding. Medieval medicine was absolutely insistent that babies needed milk, preferably from the mother, but also possibly from a wet nurse who might be dragged in from outside if someone was willing to pay for it. Poorer babies, of course, had no such luck. Their mothers breastfed if they were able. If not, improvised feeding methods might be tried, such as softened bread mashed with water, which is, as you might imagine, not a winning diet for an infant. So yes, babies born in prison faced a rather uphill battle, but occasionally one would survive and grow up. And here's where the story gets oddly interesting, because these children sometimes became part of prison folklore. Imagine the local town gossip. Oh, that boy, born behind bars he was. The medieval equivalent of a dramatic backstory. It could be a mark of shame, yes, but also occasionally of strange pride, proof of resilience or divine favor. In some cities, like Florence and Venice, civic records even contain notes about children of prisoners being placed into foundling hospitals. These were sort of proto-orphanages, often run by religious orders. They took in babies left at their doors, sometimes with a token from the mother, a piece of cloth, half a coin, that could, in theory, identify the child if she ever came back. Of course, most mothers never did come back. Life was uncertain, but the tokens remained, carefully catalogued, like medieval lost and found. Today, museums still preserve some of these tiny scraps. A torn bit of embroidery, a coin cut in two, evidence of mothers who wanted their babies remembered, even if they couldn't keep them. And what about the fathers of these prison-born children? Were they ever around? Not usually. Fathers, if alive and interested, were often on the outside, trying to scrape together money for bail or fines. Sometimes they were in a different cell entirely. In many cases, the identity of the father wasn't even recorded. For a poor woman, the child was simply another liability. For a noble woman, the father's name might be trumpeted loudly, unless it was politically inconvenient, in which case everyone politely ignored it. Now, perhaps you're wondering, did any of these prison-born babies grow up to be historically important? The answer is, not really. At least, not in the sense of famous monarchs or generals. Most were anonymous, but there are scattered stories of men and women remembered locally for being born in chains. Sometimes these children grew up to be clerks, servants, or minor guild members, ordinary people whose extraordinary birthplace gave them a peculiar nickname. There's one 14th century example in France of a boy who was literally nicknamed Prison Born. The chronicles don't even bother to give his actual name, which is both cruel and very on-brand for medieval record-keeping. So, what can we conclude? Babies born in medieval prisons were unlucky, but not always doomed. If poor, they might remain with their mother in squalid conditions, or be handed over to a monastery. If wealthy, they might be raised under slightly better circumstances, and perhaps even folded back into dynastic politics. But in every case, the experience underlines something quietly bleak about medieval justice. prisons weren't built with human lives in mind. They were temporary holding pens, and when new life appeared inside them, it was treated as an inconvenience, a side effect, something to be shuffled along rather than planned for. And now, since you're hopefully feeling a little heavier in the eyelids, let's gently drift away from the damp straw and iron bars and move toward another corner of strange, unfortunate history. Because next, we're going to wander into the lives of eunuchs in ancient Rome, the forgotten servants, advisors, and scapegoats of an empire that never quite knew what to do with them. But that's part 2. So for now, close your eyes, take a slow breath, and remember, if you're listening from the comfort of a warm bed, you're already luckier than a baby born in a medieval dungeon. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's keep drifting along. We've left the damp, straw-covered corners of medieval prisons behind, and now we're floating towards something Rome never wanted to talk about, but definitely relied on anyway. Eunuchs. Yes, eunuchs. The men who weren't quite men, at least according to Roman definitions. They were the half-acknowledged, often mocked, sometimes feared figures lingering in the corners of ancient society. Rome liked to pretend it was far too dignified for such things. And yet, there they were. So tonight we're going to let them step into the spotlight. Gently, of course. First, let's be clear. Rome did not invent eunuchs. The practice was older than Rome itself, going back to Mesopotamia, Persia, Egypt, and beyond. Everywhere powerful kings wanted servants who were considered safe around royal women or unlikely to found rival dynasties, eunuchs showed up. Convenient, in a bleak sort of way. But the Romans? They were complicated about it. They liked to sneer at other cultures for relying on eunuchs. To a Roman senator, the idea of mutilating a man and then giving him political power seemed absurd. Rome was supposed to be virile, masculine, disciplined, a city of soldiers, farmers, and stern fathers wagging fingers at wayward sons. Naturally, this meant Rome ended up using eunuchs anyway. Hypocrisy is always in fashion. So where did these men come from? In Rome, eunuchs weren't usually made locally, at least not officially. Roman law, for much of the empire, actually banned the practice of castration. But laws on parchment rarely stopped demand. Eunuchs were imported, often from the east, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt. Traders, slave dealers, and occasionally entire households would bring them westward, where they quietly filled roles that Romans pretended not to notice. Wealthy households, especially imperial ones, found them useful. Eunuchs were attendants, chamberlains, guardians of the inner quarters. In palaces, they often worked in the women's apartments, the gymnasium, which makes sense. If you're a paranoid emperor, you don't want rival heirs sneaking into your household by unconventional means. Eunuchs were considered, in blunt Roman phrasing, safe. Of course, safe was relative. Politics is never safe. And some eunuchs turned out to be far more dangerous than expected. Now, to most ordinary Romans, the eunuch was a punchline. Writers loved to mock them. Satirists especially. The poet Juvenal, for example, couldn't resist throwing in jabs about effeminate men, eunuchs among them. To him, they were unnatural, soft, un-Roman. The very word spado, one of the Latin terms for eunuch, carried a sneer. It implied uselessness, someone cut off, incomplete. And yet, while the satirists chuckled, emperors quietly employed them. A eunuch might be the person guarding imperial treasures or delivering messages no one else was trusted to carry. They were the invisible glue of court life. No one wanted to acknowledge them, but everyone needed them, Let's drift to one particularly famous example, the court of Elagabalus. Now, Elagabalus was not exactly Rome's model emperor. He was a teenage Syrian priest who somehow ended up ruling the empire in the 3rd century, and his reign was essentially one long episode of What If a Soap Opera Had a Budget. Elagabalus adored extravagance. He adored breaking taboos, and naturally he surrounded himself with eunuchs. Ancient sources complain about the influence of one in particular, a man named Heracles, who, depending on which scandalous rumor you believe, was either a charioteer, a eunuch, or both. The lines blur. With Elagabalus, they always do. The point is, even at Rome's highest levels, eunuchs slipped into the story, shaping decisions in ways senators found horrifying, which was, frankly, part of the fun for Elagabalus. Another figure worth mentioning, the eunuch chamberlains of the later empire. As the centuries rolled on, Rome grew more comfortable with imperial pomp. The empire's eastern half, especially, borrowed heavily from Persian court traditions, which meant eunuchs everywhere. By the 4th and 5th centuries, eunuchs were no longer just household servants. They had become high-ranking courtiers. Some wielded immense influence. They controlled access to the emperor, managed finances, and sometimes even led armies. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, never one to pass up a good rant, grumbled that eunuchs had too much power at court. He describes them as meddling, whispering, scheming. In other words, he hated them, which is usually a sign they were doing something effective. But what about their personal lives? What was it actually like to be one of these forgotten men in Rome? Well, sources are patchy and always filtered through prejudice. But a few things stand out. Eunuchs occupied a strange liminal space. They were trusted in some ways, excluded in others. Many were slaves, bound to service with no escape. Others, especially in the later empire, could rise astonishingly high, commanding wealth, prestige, even titles. Still, Roman masculinity was obsessed with the idea of manhood as dominance, fertility, authority. A eunuch stood outside all that, which meant he was always viewed with suspicion, too close to women, too unnatural to be fully Roman, and yet too useful to discard. It was a precarious balancing act. You were powerful, but never quite respected, essential, but mocked, a shadow in the imperial halls. Sometimes eunuchs were scapegoats. When things went wrong, emperors or senators blamed them. It was convenient. You could accuse them of corrupting morals or manipulating rulers without directly insulting the emperor himself. The eunuchs did it was the Roman equivalent of, "My advisors misled me." This reputation clung to them for centuries. Even into the Byzantine Empire, which adored eunuchs and gave them official ranks, the stereotype persisted: sly, scheming, untrustworthy, and, of course, slightly tragic. It's worth noting that not all eunuchs were imported slaves. Some were created closer to home, despite the official bans. Parents, desperate for money, sometimes castrated sons to sell them at higher value. It's grim, yes, but also a reminder that Rome's glittering palaces ran on the suffering of the poor. Other men may have chosen the path, particularly if they wanted access to palace service. Though choice is a generous word in a society where survival often required surrendering something vital. So, why are they forgotten? Partly because history loves its heroes bold and uncomplicated. Emperors, generals, gladiators, the traditional Roman caste. Eunuchs don't fit the mold. They lived in the margins. They thrived in whispers. They kept secrets. And when chroniclers did mention them, it was often to ridicule or condemn. But if we look closely, Their fingerprints are everywhere. In the letters carried, the treasuries managed, the audiences controlled. Every time a senator complained that he couldn't reach the emperor without bribing a eunuch, you can almost hear the quiet chuckle of a man who, despite all the mockery, was very much in control. So what happened to the eunuchs of ancient Rome? They endured, they adapted, and eventually they passed their legacy on to Byzantium, where eunuchs became not just servants, but entire political classes. Some rose to become generals, admirals, even patriarchs of the church. The Byzantine court without eunuchs would be like modern politics without lobbyists, technically imaginable, but never actually real. In Rome itself, though, their memory faded. They became the nameless spadones in satirical texts, or the sinister advisors blamed for decadence, forgotten not because they didn't matter, but because they mattered too much in ways that made people uncomfortable. And with that, we'll let them slip back into the shadows of the imperial palace, whispering, advising, carrying their scrolls, never fully acknowledged, but always present. Take a slow breath, maybe roll onto your side, and let's drift forward, because in our next wandering, we're going to leave Rome behind and move to the glittering, clanking world of medieval knights. Specifically, what happened when knights fell out of favor, when they were fired, disgraced, or simply too old for the saddle. But that's part 3. For now, close your eyes. And if you dream of Rome tonight, don't imagine the emperors on their thrones. Imagine the quiet figures in the corner, forgotten, mocked, but holding the keys to every door that mattered. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's leave behind the whispers of Roman eunuchs and wander across a few centuries into the clanking, creaking, occasionally absurd world of medieval knights. You know, the shining armor, the jousting tournaments, the honor codes that people pretended to follow while quietly ignoring them. But tonight, instead of focusing on the glorious victories or romantic tales, we're going to ask a much more practical and much less glamorous question. Did medieval knights ever get fired? Because yes, believe it or not, even knights had job performance issues. First, let's remind ourselves, being a knight wasn't originally a fancy title. In the early Middle Ages, it was just a job description. You were a warrior on horseback. You showed up when your lord called you, and you brought a sharp weapon, a horse that hopefully didn't fall over too often, and the willingness to charge at people you'd never met. Over time, of course, knighthood became wrapped up in all the glittering nonsense of chivalry, honor, and courtly love. The sort of thing that sounds noble when read aloud in a candlelit hall, but much less noble when you're stuck in a muddy field, trying to pry your lance out of someone's chest plate. But regardless of the poetry, knights were employees. They had bosses, they had contracts, and yes, sometimes they got fired. So, what counted as fireable behavior in Knight World? Well, the obvious, cowardice. If you fled a battlefield when everyone else was still charging bravely to their deaths, people noticed. A knight who turned tail could expect whispers, mockery, and sometimes outright dismissal from his lord's service. Nothing kills a military career faster than demonstrating that you'd rather be anywhere else when the arrows start flying. There's a 14th century French chronicler who complains about knights of great armor but small courage. It's basically the medieval version of a performance review. And yes, those knights usually found themselves unemployed. Then there was incompetence. Not every knight was actually good at fighting. Some were clumsy or unlucky, or simply better at boasting than brawling. Lords noticed. A knight who lost too many tournaments or botched too many battles could quietly be dropped from the payroll. fired not with an official HR meeting, but with the medieval equivalent of, "Don't call us, we'll call you." The chronicles are littered with these forgotten men, names mentioned once in some campaign list, and then never again. You can almost imagine them slinking back home, armor-dented, trying to explain to their families that the whole glorious knight thing hadn't quite worked out. Another reason knights got fired: bad manners. Now, you'd think manners would be a low priority in a profession built on stabbing people. But remember, knights weren't just fighters. They were also supposed to embody chivalry, at least in theory, which meant lords cared about reputation. If a knight was too violent off the battlefield, robbing peasants, harassing women, or picking fights in taverns, he could embarrass his employer. And embarrassment, in a feudal society obsessed with status, was often worse than actual battlefield defeat. So yes, some knights lost their positions for being, let's call it, HR disasters. Imagine a man in full armor getting written up for inappropriate conduct at the castle feast. Debt was another killer. Knights were expensive. Horses, armor, weapons, it all added up. A knight drowning in debt was a liability. He might sell his loyalty to the highest bidder. He might pawn his equipment. He might even, gasp, lose his horse. And a knight without a horse is basically just a heavily dressed man with poor cardio. Lords didn't like unreliable men. So, financially ruined knights often found themselves politely, or not so politely, shown the door. Now, what about age? Yes, knights could absolutely be fired for being too old. It's a cruel reality. Shining armor looks a lot less impressive when the man inside it has knees that sound like breaking twigs. Medieval chroniclers occasionally mention aged knights who were honored for their service but no longer expected to fight. Some retired gracefully. Others were quietly dropped from the rolls and left to grumble about "back in my day." Aging out of knighthood wasn't always shameful, though. Sometimes it meant being promoted upward, into advisory roles, or into managing estates. But for others, it was more like being phased out of the office, with no pension plan except the hope that your children would feed you. Of course, not every firing was permanent. Knights could sometimes bounce back. Medieval employment was flexible, if chaotic. A knight disgraced in one lord's service might simply pack up and ride to another castle, offering his sword to a new employer. It was a bit like updating your resume, except your resume was, "I promise not to flee this time." This is how many knights ended up as mercenaries. Fired, disgraced, or simply bored. They joined companies of free soldiers, wandering Europe in search of pay. These mercenary bands terrified towns, drained treasuries, and occasionally toppled governments. It turns out firing knights didn't always make them disappear. Sometimes it just made them everyone's problem. Let's not forget the knights who were fired by more permanent methods. If you betrayed your lord by switching sides in a feud or selling secrets to the enemy, you might not just lose your job, you might lose your head. Betrayal was one of the few sins medieval society consistently punished with enthusiasm. A knight caught being treacherous could expect a swift and usually public downfall. Executions were a form of very dramatic termination. So, did knights ever get formal notice? A little parchment saying, "Thanks for your service. Please clean out your saddlebags"? Not really. Medieval employment was more personal. A lord might simply stop summoning you, or, if he was feeling dramatic, he might publicly strip you of your spurs. The symbol of knighthood. Imagine a ceremony where your boss literally pulls off your shoes to show you're fired. That happened. There were also cases where knights were shamed by being forced to carry a saddle or even walk instead of ride. Symbolic humiliation was a medieval specialty. Subtlety was not. And how did knights themselves react to being fired? Poorly, very poorly. Remember, knighthood wasn't just a job, it was an identity. Losing it was humiliating. Some men tried to redeem themselves by performing heroic deeds, usually reckless ones. Others wandered, bitter and broke, until death. A few tried their luck in the Crusades, which doubled as both penance and a very long business trip. One 13th century knight, fired for cowardice, famously tried to win back honor by fighting a duel against 3 opponents at once. He lost. But hey, at least no one could call him a coward after that. So, what do we learn from all this? Yes, medieval knights could get fired. They could lose their jobs for cowardice, incompetence, bad manners, debt, age, or betrayal. Sometimes gently, sometimes violently, sometimes humiliatingly. It's oddly comforting, really. Even in a world of castles and swords, job insecurity was alive and well. Knights weren't that different from us. They just had louder armor and fewer dental options. And with that, let's let the knights ride off into the sunset. Some triumphant, others unemployed, all of them creaking under the weight of their own armor. Take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. And let's drift onward to our next strange historical curiosity. Because next we're going to ask, how did ordinary Vikings handle death? Not the kings with their ship burials and golden swords, but the everyday farmer warriors who died in mud huts and fishing villages.